Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the Cyber Gizmo, I'm going to delve in and look at some benchmarking on some of the machines that I have laying around here, and we'll get started with that right after this. So I've been working on trying to get together a set of benchmarks that I can use to do evaluations on hardware. And in a week's time, I haven't gotten very far. It takes quite a bit of time to get the benchmarks chosen. But anyway, I wanted to do this because of some of the comments that I made on the Odroid H2, and I wanted to see if I could empirically find out if those comments were true or not. So let's dive in a little bit and get started. So the first benchmark suite that I ran was the Byte benchmark, also known as the Unix benchmark, and this is version 5.13, which is current as of the time of this video. It goes through two different distinct passes. The first one is it just runs workloads, which would load up a single processor, and then it adds on additional workloads to peak out the number based on the number of cores that it finds. So, and then it reruns the same test. It does tests in dry stones and wet stones. It does tests against the file system, and it does some tests like an Excel spreadsheet user would do. It does some shell scripting. It does some system calls. It's generally not considered a valid benchmark today as far as being the closest that you can get to the hardware. It was designed at a time before threading and hyper-threading was around. So it's generally considered to be a monolithic test. But as a basis of comparison between machines with similar architectures, I kind of tend to lean toward it's valid, at least from the standpoint of comparison from one machine architecture to another. Now, I wouldn't go as far as saying that this is the definitive test that I want to use. I would prefer to use LinPack. The problem I have with LinPack is that because Intel actually owns the licenses to LinPack, it is open source, yes, but in the benchmarks that you can get, other than the full-blown package that would take days to set up and probably days to run, it has assembler code in it, and so that assembler, of course, won't run on ARM, and that needs to be addressed. So I have not been able to include. I can certainly do the Intel machines with LinPack, and I might do that in the future. But it definitely leaves out the ARM. So kind of the basis for the test, and we'll talk about this. The top performing machine is Black Ice, which is it's an older 6700K. That's what I used to make these videos on. It is of course stark contrast to the rest of the machines, quite a bit faster, both in the single and in the multi-core test. The next one down, Blue Ice, that is a Intel Skull Canyon, and it uses a mobile processor, also in the 6700 family. It's a 6770 HQ, I believe. And then Green Ice, which is the Odroid H2, which I just got, followed by the Rock 2, which is a Pine 64 Rock 64 Pro. And that, of course, is based on the Rock chip RK3399. Then the Pi 4, and the Pi 4 was dismally disappointing. I think there is an issue, not with the Pi, but with the benchmark. So I want to go investigate that a bit further. The Pi's performance, I would expect to see a lot higher than this. I would actually think that it would be more in line with probably the Rock 2. So I'm going to go back and check and find out what happened because that just to disregard that benchmark result for now. The N2 is an Odroid N2, and then there's the XU4. I'll talk about conclusions later, but it's pretty clear that the N2 outperformed the Green Ice, which is the H2 machine, and both in single and in multi-core. And of course, that is a ARM-based machine. But to talk a little bit about these machines, I'd mentioned that Black Ice is an Intel 6700K. It is running, I tried to standardize as much as I could on the operating system. Now, in the ARM's case, I can't. There are some problems running Fedora on ARM at the moment, particularly with the Odroid ARM. So it's not a fault of Fedora. It's just the way Odroid does things, and so Fedora doesn't work. Fedora 3.1, kernel 548-200. It's 6700, has a slight overclock 4.2. Memory is 32 gig, and then there's a Samsung 970 Pro 256 gigabyte M.2 drive. Now, I'll talk again at the end about this. Standardizing all of this would be great. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen anytime soon. As far as the I/O zone tests, Black Ice ran. This is the same I/O zone test that I ran for the NAS versus Gluster. So if you're interested in the methodology behind that and what these tests do, you can go see that video, and I'll put a link to it here so you can find that. But this goes between 1 and 5 users, and then it runs this series of tests. What you look for in this one is you expect to see kind of a gradual slope as it ramps up from 1 to 5 users, and then you don't want to see it flatline anywhere. And in several cases, like on the random write and random read, the random write and the p write, those kind of went down as the user's account went up. I saw that in the in the NAS versus Gluster test too, and that could just be that it's just peaking. It is just those really slam the drives hard, so it could be that it's just peaking the channel. But in the other cases, it seemed to perform about as I would expect. I mean, you kind of expect it to scale up at some point and then flatline. So overall, for this old of a drive, not bad. I mean, that's about as good as that drive can really do. Blue Ice, which is the Nux Skull Canyon, that's also Fedora 3.1. It's the same kernel as before. It's 6770 HQ. It's 3.5 gigahertz, 32 gig of memory in there, and it runs the 970 Pro 500. Now, in this case, because of the difference in the drives, the I/O throughput was much higher. And we know that. We know that the larger drive sizes up to a point do perform better than the smaller ones do because of the nature of the hardware inside of the NVMe. So this was not a surprise, really. And I do say it was a surprise at the end, but it really wasn't. And that is to be expected. This is also a 950. It's the only difference between them is the size. So yeah, the performance of this was much higher than it was on Black Ice. So probably need to move that drive in here and swap one of the 970s into Blue Ice. Green Ice, the Odroid H2, also Fedora 3.1. It's a J4104, not 05, as I said. It's a 2.5 gigahertz, 16 gig of memory. It uses a 970 EVO. And the performance spec on this one was disappointing. I mean, it wasn't bad. It's not horrible, but you can see clearly that there is something holding this guy back, and I think it's the PCIe 2.0 interface. It is definitely throttling it back to almost 80% of the speed, which 50% of that probably would be the bus, but there's something else going on here too. As far as scalability on it, it works fine up until you hit the 5th user, and then it just kind of dies. And so that really is pointing to me that the first place I would go look is the channel at that one, because at 5 users you are really stuffing a lot of data into the channel, and that would be the first place I would look on this for a problem. The Rock 2 Pine 64, it's running an Ubuntu, and as I had mentioned, that is. There are other options you can run on that card today. And so, but these have been set up for a while, and I have not done anything to change them. They're an older kernel, 4.4, which for this particular version of Ubuntu was the most current as of mid-December. Haven't checked since. It is an Arcade 3390 at 1.5 gigahertz. It has 4 gig of memory. It's a 950 Evo 500 gig that's in there, but it's the NVMe does not have a slot on the sock. Instead, you have to mount it to a PCIe card, and that's a 4 slot that it fits into. And I think that's PCIe 1. I don't think that's even PCIe 2. So yeah, clearly that is pointing to a flat line. You can see it just caps off at 800,000 kilobits a second. So yeah, there's definitely a channel problem with this. I mean, I have no doubt that is channel related. That's what's holding that back. So if Pine 64 were to do something about that in a future version, then this would be a much higher performant chip in terms of using NVMe. So yeah, I'm not going to spend much more time on that. I don't want to beat them to death over it. That was a choice they did, I'm sure, to try to hold costs back. So I did not test the I/O on the Pi 4, the NT, or the XU4. The reason for that is they do not support NVMe. They do. Some of those do support SATA, like the XU4. There's a version that supports SATA. But as I had mentioned before, those interfaces go through the USB 3.0. So yeah, you're going to be limited in performance with those. So I didn't bother to test the I/O. I would end up testing the I/O on the SD card, on the eMMC cards that are in those machines. And I didn't feel that would be a real fair test, since I already know, and you already know, SD cards do not perform at the same level as an NVMe. And so there's no need to benchmark that. We already know that. There is a need, I think, in this to do additional benchmarks, and I'm working on that. I have some other choices that I would like to include in this. I don't want to do a scattergun attack on the benchmarks. A lot of these benchmarking systems they'll just pull in a whole bunch of benchmarks and run them forever, and they running multiple passes is always good. But if you follow a methodology, if you clean out the systems first and then run it, you're going to get consistent results across the board within, a margin of error. But what I would like to do is to really determine a set of benchmarks that are meaningful to a person that's running a system as a server or running the system as a workstation. So rather than try to do stress benchmarks, which prove nothing, because very few people run their machines at full tilt all day long, and if you did, you'd probably be running into hardware problems pretty quick. I would prefer to benchmark in real world or near real world conditions as possible, because that really gives you a feel for how your system is going to perform based on how you use it. So that's what I'm trying to do. I need to include AMD CPUs in this, most definitely, and especially under Linux, see where the problems are, where some of the advantages are to their architecture. I have tried to standardize the OS tests as much as I can. I know that Fedora is probably not the best choice to use in these benchmarks, but you run into issues if you were to run Clear Linux. Those are written for Intel, and so they are really going to optimize the Intel hardware a lot more than they would any other machine. I could pick Debian, but then I run into problems with the kernel. And one of the things that was kind of interesting is Phoronix recently published an article about the versions of the kernel getting slower over time, and I think he started measuring it at 4.16, I think, back that far. And it's pretty clear that it runs along pretty fast for a while, but the later releases and getting into especially like the 5.4 kernel, performance is really dropping. Now, part of that is probably because of all of the inserts into the kernel to mitigate around the problems that we saw last year with Intel's hardware, particularly in vulnerabilities with threading, caching, and side channel communication problems. So yeah, that's going to have an impact on performance if you're pulling basically the multi-threading out and you're also pulling out the advantages of the cache. So anyway, but he did not. I don't think that that's based on the amount of performance drop in there. I don't think that's totally the explanation. There's something else going on. And the Pharonics blogger also alluded to that there's something else that's going on besides just all the fixes for all the Intel problems. So need to standardize on an NVMe. It'll probably be the 970, so I'll get to that over time. The Pi 4 was slower than expected. As I said, need to find out why, so just disregard that for now. I don't believe that test. N2 is better than the H2, but again, depends on whether you want NVMe support or not. That board may be just fine if that's what you want. But it is clearly you're going to be handicapped on that machine with PCIe 2. Samsung M2 970 is faster than the other NVMe's. Yeah, we know that. Performance in the I/O on Blue Ice was surprising, and the explanation is the difference between the 500 and the 256. The Rock 2 needs a better NVMe interface. I don't think there's any argument there. So I think as far as some things to do in the future, like I said, the benchmarks that I really want are really more timed around real world scenarios. So I have some ideas on that. I would like to figure out how to get the Linpack ones to work on ARM, and so I'm going to work on that over the coming weeks to try to get those running for you. I hope you enjoyed this today, and if you did, please, as always, like and subscribe. And by the way, the channel is quickly approaching 500 subscribers, and I'm just totally blown away. I never expected this. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I was just thanking you all for the 200 subscriptions, and now, 500 of you find this channel worthwhile, and that's great. I really appreciate all the things that you guys have commented about, the suggestions that you've made to the channel. Even the negative comments have been great, because if they're constructive, that helps. If they're not constructive, well, there's no point to learning anything from that. So thank you all so much. Hope to see you again real soon, and bye for now.